Welcome to all participants to Day 3 of the Forest Harvest CBNE Forum 2021. Thank you for joining us this week as we foster information exchange, capacity enhancement, market engagement, and political action in support of community-based NTFP enterprises. This session is being recorded and it will be translated in Bahasa Indonesia, Filipino, Khmer, Vietnamese, and Thai. If you need a translation, please click the interpretation button below your screen and choose your language. You may mute or unmute the original speaker. Our session today is on the state of policies and programs that support CBNEs, initiating an outlook for NTFP's process. It is presented to you all by the NTFP-EP with the Asean Secretariat, Food, Agriculture, and Forestry Division. This is our second session together that we organized to bring you policy developments and insights on NTFPs for our conducive environment stream. Yesterday, we had a public session to introduce the latest endorsed by the senior ministers in agriculture and forestry and ASEAN guidelines on NTFP protocols for sustainable management of NTFPs. Let's hear more about other policy inroads and opportunities for support to CBNEs this afternoon. So let me introduce our moderator for this session, Dr. Doris Capistrano. She is a member of the C4 ICRAF Common Board of Trustees. Dr. Doris has extensive experience in research and development, ecosystems assessment and policy, international cooperation, capacity building, and grant making. She was senior advisor to the SDC ASEAN-Swiss Partnership on Social Forestry and Climate Change, director of Forest and Governance Research at C4, and deputy representative at the Ford Foundation. She was a member of the UN Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Panel and served in other international technical bodies. Currently, she is Senior Fellow of the Southeast Asian Regional Center for Graduate Study and Research in Agriculture, or CIRCA, and Fellow of the Rights and Resources Initiative, RRI. She will now open the session and tell us more about it. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Doris Capistrano. Thanks, Doris.
Outlook for NTFP process. This session will be an important kickstarter of a process to increase policy support mechanisms for CBNEs in the ASEAN region specifically. For the next hour and a half, we will hear about current status of policies and programs that support CBNEs as well as strategic opportunities for their further development. We hope this will serve as an inspiration for governments to develop supportive policies to facilitate CBNE development in their own countries. We expect and hope by the end of the session to have identified key steps, roles, and commitments to support CBNEs and initiate a process that will take stock and build on NTFP development over the years, and consider scenarios for further NTFP development into the future. A very important session indeed. Our first speaker, who will give us a global analysis on policies and views on the outlook of NTFPs, is Dr. Sarah Laird, the co-director of People and Plants International and a research associate with the University of Cape Town's Bioeconomy Chair. A forester and ethnobiologist by training, her interests cover a range of interrelated issues, including forest-based traditional knowledge and livelihoods, biodiversity and NTFP law and policy, as well as emerging technologies and the ethical and conservation dimensions of the commercial use of biodiversity. She has written numerous publications on NTFP policies and is the lead editor for the publication Wild Product Governance, Finding Policies That Work for Non-Timber Forest Products, published in 2011. In this publication, authors point out that despite the importance of NTFPs to rural livelihoods, to companies and to governments, there is little information available for those seeking to develop effective policy frameworks and regulations. Dr. Laird's current policy work includes ethical and conservation implications of transformative scientific and technological advances, particularly within the framework of the Convention on Biological Diversity. Dr. Laird holds a BA in History from McGill University, an MS in Forestry from Oxford University, and a PhD in Ethnobiology from the University of Kent. Dr. Laird will be co-presenting with Dr. Rachel Weinberg. Dr. Weinberg is co-director of People and Plants International and is a professor in the Department of Environmental and Geographical Science at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. Dr. Weinberg holds a South African research chair focused on environmental and social dimensions of the bioeconomy. Her research focuses on biopolitics, the commercialization and trade of biodiversity, access and benefit sharing, and focuses on wider questions about governance, livelihoods, rights to resources, and traditional knowledge. Dr. Weinberg also has a strong interest in agroecology and alternative agricultural futures. Dr. Laird is not able to join us, but they have a presentation that has been pre-recorded, but Dr. Weinberg will be with us for a question and answer session later. Now let's hear from Dr. Laird and Dr. Weinberg.
Hi, I'm Sarah Laird, and I will speak briefly today about the legal and policy context of NTFP use, management, and trade. Non-timber forest products have significant local, regional, and global markets and are widely used for a range of purposes. Species can be traded very locally for food and medicine and other purposes, or might be part of large global markets like rattan and Brazil nuts. Global industries reliant on NTFPs have grown significantly in recent decades and include the botanical or herbal medicine sectors, natural personal care, and food and beverage. The global trade in medicinal and aromatic plant species, for example, almost tripled in recent years, from $1.3 billion in 1998 to $3.3 billion in 2018. NTFPs are also a critical source of cash income in local markets, providing funds for schools, medicines, and other purchased items. Markets for NTFPs are significant, but by far the largest and most diverse use of NTFPs is for subsistence within rural communities. These values are poorly documented, but examples of a few studies here indicate the value of subsistence. It is always important to keep this in mind when discussing law and policy, and to ensure that subsistence is not negatively impacted by NTFP measures. The diversity of NTFPs creates challenges for effective law and policy. A law that supports sustainable and equitable local and regional trade will naturally be very different from a law that regulates global and commodity trade. The diversity in activities also partly explains why most NTFP laws are ad hoc. They lack a strategy, and they're often tagged on to other laws, timber-centric forestry laws, or more recently, they've been incorporated into access and benefit sharing measures. NTFPs are not part of a single industry and break down into multiple and diverse sectors and activities. We know they are not timber, but the category of NTFPs encompasses such a wide-ranging and diverse set of products, activities, and stakeholder groups, it is difficult to encapsulate in a single policy or law. The vast majority of attention on NTFP law and policy is focused on global and often commodity trade, which is more visible and easier to regulate. This is often a good thing. These are the products that require more regulation, while subsistence and local trade often do not benefit when governments intervene. NTFP species in international trade have unique opportunities and challenges when it comes to law and policy. Challenges include fickle markets driven by consumer fads and new research that raises safety and efficacy concerns and causes markets to drop, as well as difficulties supplying sudden booms in demand. Opportunities include certification and marketing programs, corporate social responsibility, and other voluntary approaches that inform consumers about raw material sourcing through product labeling and can provide communities with access to markets and premium prices. However, these approaches require uniform, often global standards that fit poorly with NTFPs in local and regional trade, which are ecologically and culturally diverse, geographically dispersed, and each species tends to have a relatively low value. That's not always the case by any means, but many do. It is an aggregate in many regions where you find the real value of subsistence use and local and regional trade of NTFPs, which can dwarf in size export markets. It's important, therefore, that along with subsistence use, policies regulating global trade do not negatively impact local and regional markets. Too often, the impacts of laws, including a dramatic escalation in bureaucratic requirements and corruption, are not understood or considered when policies are developed. It is also important for governments to consider ways to support local and regional trade and help make them more equitable and sustainable, including through partnerships with trade and producer associations. As a first step, a great deal of information and capacity is needed to develop effective NTFP laws and policies. Because for many years, and in some countries still today, NTFPs were considered minor or secondary forest products, basic information on their ecology, trade, and use was not available, and capacity within government departments was limited. At the same time, government funding and support to implement NTFP laws and support sustainable and equitable NTFP use can be inconsistent and inadequate. There are many types of power and social relations manifested in the harvest and trade of NTFPs that can help determine whether these activities will be sustainable and equitable, and whether they support or undermine the livelihoods of groups dependent upon them. It is critical that power dynamics and political and economic inequalities are understood prior to policy formulation and implementation. Otherwise, measures will be ineffective and might produce unintended consequences. For example, further marginalizing harvesters, generating new forms of inequity, creating overwhelming bureaucracy and openings for corruption, and even criminalizing NTFP extraction. When customary law has broken down to a significant degree or outside commercial pressure has intensified beyond the carrying capacity of traditional measures, governments can offer important and necessary levels of regulation. But when customary law is strong, it can serve as a more effective, accepted, and nuanced approach, integrating local cultural, ecological, and economic conditions in ways that better suit the diversity of NTFPs. Governments should explore NTFP policy frameworks that integrate customary law and governance systems. NTFP law and policy must also be situated within the wider range of laws that directly and indirectly impact forests and NTFPs. This ecosystem of laws includes natural resource, agriculture, forestry, land tenure, transportation, intellectual property, quality control, and others. It also includes regional and international laws and policies like trade agreements, CITES, and the Convention on Biodiversity. It is important that understanding of the existing regulatory ecosystem surrounding NTFPs is part of the policy formulation process. Part of the international legal ecosystem is access and benefit sharing. Although under the Convention on Biodiversity, NTFPs were not originally envisioned as part of the scope. and the focus was on genetic resources used in high-tech sectors. But in recent years, some governments have expanded the scope of ABS to include biotrade, or NTFPs. ABS has added yet another layer of regulation to an already confusing mix of measures impacting NTFPs, and it does not seem likely that this will lead to greater sustainability and equity, and may indeed produce a myriad of unintended consequences. NTFP law and policy working to promote sustainable use and conservation should also be placed within the context of broader land use practices. Forest degradation and destruction resulting from agriculture, logging, mining, and other land uses are causing enormous damage to forests. For example, the drivers of a 12% increase in tropical forest loss in 2019 and 2020, 100,000 square miles of tree cover, is fires and the expansion of agriculture. Clearly, as CITES appendices and national endangered species listings make clear, NTFPs can be badly overharvested. But for the majority of NTFP species, this is not the case, and real threats to NTFPs come from other land uses. We must also be clear that while sustainable and equitable harvest, use, and trade of NTFPs are important goals, they will not create incentives that counter the activities currently leading to forest and biodiversity loss. These are very small activities compared to sort of massive transformation of landscapes for agriculture and logging and mining. In summary, then, things to keep in mind while working on NTFP policy development include, first, true consultation. Iterative, ongoing, and engaging the full range of stakeholders, including harvesters and producers, traders, companies, government, researchers, NGOs, and others. True consultation leads to more informed and effective policies that reflect the real needs and priorities of local groups, and also helps ensure policies are widely accepted and implemented. Second, the importance of strategy and coordination. NTFP laws rarely result from a systematic and strategic approach, and are instead usually an ad hoc response to a crisis of overharvesting or overly optimistic estimates of tax revenue should informal activities be made more formal. But NTFP laws, like any law, need clear objectives and should grow from a strategy based on research and information. Often the most basic questions for NTFP regulation remain unanswered. What are we regulating and why? Coordination of activities across government departments and building institutional capacity within government to effectively implement laws is also needed. Laws should also be targeted to particular activities and modified to reduce the impact on subsistence and local use. NTFP regulation is not a one-size-fits-all endeavor. Third, carrots or incentives can often be more effective than sticks, taxes, permits, and other hard regulation approaches. When species experience sudden commercial demand or prolonged unsustainable harvesting, however, then sticks and a combination of approaches are required. Moving forward, with greater information, effective consultations, and strategic approaches to policymaking, NTFP laws and policies can promote equity and sustainability for species and trade. First, however, we must work to protect intact natural forests. They conserve biodiversity, store carbon, and support livelihoods and traditions that tie people to place and nature, including the management and use of NTFPs. We then need to undertake research, build capacity, and develop a strategy for NTFP laws. Listen to the voices of producers, harvesters, traders, and others who know what is likely to work or not and what is needed, but are often marginalized from policy discussions. We need to understand and consider the regulatory ecosystem, streamline laws when possible, and ensure institutional coordination and collaboration. Governments will also ideally have an interest in actually implementing laws that have been developed. Too often, good laws sit on the books and are poorly implemented, if at all. And finally, a lesson that has emerged around the world in recent decades is that less is often more when it comes to regulation of NTFPs. Simplicity often reduces bureaucracy, costs, confusion, and corruption, and increases compliance. A light hand, reflecting the real financial, ecological, and social costs and benefits of regulation, as well as implementation capacity and the likelihood of compliance, is often the most effective. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much for that presentation, Dr. Laird. And Dr. Weinberg is still able to respond to questions, but she has to leave the meeting shortly. So if you would allow me, I would take the opportunity to probably ask one question. And I'm monitoring the chat box as well, if there are any other questions, if we have the time. But thank you so much for that very informative presentation, a very helpful overview of the status globally on NTFPs. Your presentation touched upon a number of critical points to consider on matters particularly affecting the trade of NTFPs and policy development. And you stress the point of the diversity of NTFP itself, but also the context of its use, management, and conservation. And of course, the cultural context, which is very important in this case. You also talked about a lot of the experience already embedded in local cultures, and therefore implied that perhaps over-harvesting is less of a risk than policymakers. I would like to stress that point, because policymakers, that's normally the first thing that they would raise in this context. You raised key points about equity and ecology, and one slide says carrots work better than sticks. That's a very important point, I think, that deserves a little bit more elaboration, especially for practical purposes for policymaking. So perhaps can you elaborate a little bit more and provide some examples of the carrot policy measures that seem to have worked better than others on wild products governance, and what lessons might be relevant for this region? And if Asia or ASEAN countries would like to ease up on the regulatory aspects of their NTFP regulation, what might be critical points to consider and key starting points? Dr. Weinberg.
Sure. And thank you very much for this invitation. It's a great pleasure to speak to everybody today. So, yeah, I mean, I think the question of carrots or incentives is a really critical one for NTFP policy and regulation. And it can be many different approaches. I think some of those Sarah touched on in her presentation, where she was speaking about the critical need for partnerships and for producer support. So simply giving producers the kind of support in terms of information about permitting, support towards better organization among producer groups, sort of capacity development about how groups can organize their supplies better so that there is a critical mass, so that they have better ability to negotiate with buyers. I think those are really important lessons that have emerged along the way. I mean, sometimes it's very difficult because producers are particularly in sort of rural areas, are far apart from each other, and it's very hard to organize. But I think as technology improves, you know, we see a whole range of innovative tools that can be used to facilitate those sorts of interventions better. So I definitely think producer support is a critical part of the package of incentives. And then another one which Sarah mentioned was around having a supportive legal framework. So as you mentioned, Doris, not having too much bureaucracy, you know, trying to think of the bigger context. If one is talking about a forest that is already under threat from, you know, mining or agriculture, you know, what does the role of NTFP play in that bigger picture? and typically, particularly for subsistence use, less is often more. So, to really be placing the NTFP use within the broader context of land use, land and water use, and having supportive laws, and wherever possible, integrating customary laws, local practices into any regulations that may be necessary. So as commercialization increases, there generally is a need to regulate more tightly, especially with global trade. But if it's at a subsistence level, then the need is much less. And if one is starting to talk about sort of a highly commercialized product, then what does it mean in terms of tax? So, and I think that this is where there's some really important contributions that could be made. And we know that tax often doesn't end up going towards supporting the same kinds of practices that are taxed. And that to me is a really important lesson that's emerging from many places around the world. If one uses ring fences, tax towards support conservation and sustainable use in the regions which are being taxed and towards the same products or species that are being taxed, then there's a direct incentive that supports sustainable use. Rather than the tax disappearing into, funds that support other sort of activities. And then I think a last really important one that I can think about is clarifying rights and tenure. Because if people have secure rights and secure tenure, the areas over which they're managing, we know that they'll be managed a lot more strongly, and that conservation will thrive. So those are some of the incentives I can think of.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Weinberg. We have a couple of minutes in case there are other questions. I don't see any on the chat, so might I slip in another question? And the question is, do you see any role, for example, for technical development support, research development support, to organize groups for highly commercialized products, for example? Do you see this pathway towards greater domestication in some cases? Do you see that as a priority? And what might that imply to local cultures, perhaps, and benefits and access to more advanced technology and management? I know this is an area close to your heart. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think research is key, particularly with laws and policies. What we have tended to see is that laws and policies get developed in a very generic way that are not tailored towards particular species. And that this is because we just don't know enough. We don't know enough about the way in which sort of the biology of species, the context in which they've been grown and used. So certainly we need a lot more research and information about individual species that are being harvested sort of at a commercial level. With regard to the questions around domestication, I think that's a really interesting one, because inevitably as species become commercialized and scale up, domestication tends to take place. But and I think it can be a good thing in that it reduces pressure off wild populations. It can also lead to quite problematic situations in that the beneficiaries change. So whereas we might see forest dwellers being the primary beneficiaries of something that is wild harvested, as soon as you need to cultivate, you need land, you need resources, you need capital, which forest dwellers may not have. You need rights. And it often moves into the hands of a different group of beneficiaries who may have more resources and are more privileged. And that can be a problem. Another problem that we've seen with domestication, and one of the plants I work very closely with, that you may know, the rooibos tea, which is a South African plant that's used globally as a tea. So that's a plant that's moved from being a wild harvested resources to now at 95% is cultivated. And it's cultivated in a very small part of the country of South Africa where biodiversity is exceptionally high. It's one of the highest, per area. It has some of the most highest biodiversity in the world. And 57 species are threatened with extinction because of rooibos tea cultivation, because so many areas are now being cleared. As demand increases and the price goes up, more and more land gets cleared to grow rooibos. So is it supporting the local population? I would say no, in terms of the local species, and it's definitely not having a positive conservation impact. It's having a negative conservation impact. And it's also in the hands of privileged farmers rather than the small scale farmers who originally were growing the tea. So that, there's an example of where it can go wrong.
Okay. Thank you so much for those insightful comments. And I don't know how much we are, we need to move on, but there is a very short question here. There's somebody in the chat who says, make a very short question on access to benefit sharing. What are the messages addressed to policymakers directly that you can share about this? Access and benefit sharing, very briefly, Dr. Weinberg. Thanks.
Sure. So as Sarah mentioned in her presentation, access and benefit sharing, certainly in my country and several others now, NTFPs have become regulated in a similar way. And it is causing, I think, a lot of problems because it's leading to overregulation. It's leading to a very, very bureaucratic and onerous system, which is not necessarily benefiting the harvesters or the custodians of those resources. And I think the messages there again are, if something is being used for subsistence purposes and is not threatening the species, then less is more. If it's a question of equity and needing to improve benefits for producers, there are many, many other tools that already exist to do this. Some of them could be fair trade certification, enabling producers to have more negotiating power when they are discussing prices and so on. And these, to me, are much more effective tools than access to benefit sharing, which hasn't seen much impact really in terms of delivering benefits for producers. So I think we need to look at it quite critically rather than a knee-jerk reaction that it will resolve questions. It hasn't done that to date.
Okay. Thank you so much. I think that issue alone deserves another round of sessions for a future conference, but very, very important point. Thank you so much, Dr. Weinberg. Okay, now moving on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Mr. Dian Sukmajaya, who will talk about ASEAN cooperation in forestry, enhancing competitiveness, trade facilitation, and sustainable management of NTFPs. Mr. Sukmajaya is a senior officer of forestry of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations Secretariat, ASEAN Secretariat. He started his career in forestry in 1997 and joined the ASEAN Secretariat in 2008, tackling relevant issues on forestry such as sustainable forest management, forest law enforcement and governance, and forest certification. He's responsible for ASEAN cooperation in forestry, agriculture, research and development, climate change, and agricultural cooperatives. His expertise is on forest nature conservation policy, sustainable forest management, and forest governance. Please give Mr. Dian Sukmajaya a warm welcome. Dian, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Doris, for the excellent introduction. And thank you to the organizer. It is good and I think very timely for the ASEAN to move forward to support the NTFP developments in the region. You might already observe from the first speakers, when we talk about NTFP, there are many challenges. I noted that we are facing challenge on subsistence issues versus commercialization, for example, and then security rights and forest land tenure, and whether a domestication and wild is the choice, and benefit sharing, and of course intellectual property rights. Colleague, on behalf of the ASEAN Secretariat, I would like to share some priorities of the ASEAN cooperation in forestry, in particular relating on the effort to enhance competitiveness, trade facilitation, and sustainable management of non-timber forest product. So my presentation will underline the regional policy framework. Next, please. And then enhancing competitiveness, some initiative, current initiative, and also what will be the regional priorities beyond 2021 to develop, to support the NTFP development in the region and in ASEAN member state. We are delighted that we have good partners and quite expert on this area, which is NTFP-EP, that has long history with cooperate with ASEAN and ASEAN member state to address the issue on non-timber forest product from producer side to the consumer side. And we do hope that we could strengthen the cooperations beyond 2021. I just would like to briefly inform that under the ASEAN cooperation in forestry, the highest decision making is the ASEAN Senior Official on Forestry that has been mandated to address issue on sustainable forest management, and then forest law enforcement and governance, social forestry, forest and climate change, as well as forest products development. Next, please. Before I touch upon on what are the priority of the ASEAN in terms of enhancing competitiveness, I would like to highlight the highest decision by our leaders, the ASEAN leaders, that has already formulated and mandated all the sectors to be in line with the ASEAN Economic Community vision, highlighting 5 broad issues, including highly integrated and cohesive regional economy, competitive, innovative, and dynamic community, enhanced connectivity and sectoral cooperation, a resilient, inclusive, people-oriented, and people-centered community, and also a global ASEAN. I think that provide the baseline for the cooperation in forestry as well. Next, please. So based on the guidance from the ASEAN leaders, the ASEAN cooperation in forestry has set up the vision of which forest resources are sustainably managed at the landscape level to meet societal needs, socio-economic, cultural of the present, future generation, and to contribute positively to sustainable development. So there is a shifting from the sustainable forest management, not only based on the forest management unit, but we have to look also at the landscape forest management level. Next, please. For the policies, regional policy, I would like to start based on the blueprint and also guidance from the ASEAN Summit. The ASEAN cooperation in forestry has developed their own strategic plan of action. Actually, they address 5 strategic thrusts, including enhancing sustainable forest management, enhancing trade facilitation, economic integration and market access, enhancing forestry sector resilience on climate change, capacity building, human resource development, and strengthening ASEAN joint approaches and position at international and regional level. So this in this good occasion, I would like to highlight on strategic thrust number 2, which is enhancing trade facilitation, economic integration, and market access, in particular for non-timber forest product. This also relevant with the work plan for flag implementation that aiming to achieve sustainable forest management and enhance competitiveness, international competitiveness of Asian forest product to meet international requirement. But of course, we need to also note the challenge, which is already highlighted by Dr. Light, in particular related to the whether subsistence is sufficient or we want to move forward with the commercialization. And then strengthen coordination of joint strategies in seeking better market access. I think this is one of the challenges for community forestry enterprises that promote NTFP as a part of their commodity. And then develop a regional framework for mutual recognition of legality, including guidelines to recognize system used by respective ASEAN member states. Next, please. And then beside the strategic plan of actions for forestry, the working group on forest product development and also social forestry has developed plan of action. I would like to highlight several measures, action program, and activities related to the enhancing competitiveness. So cooperation of ASEAN Working Group on Forest Product Development has been mandated also to support and increase competitiveness of non-wood forest product in the international market through harmonizing standard of ASEAN forest product and specification to facilitate trade, and also joint promotion ASEAN exhibition on several NTFP, including medicinal plants. And for social forestry, I think most of you has already informed on the cooperation under this working group. Basically, the activities is some of them identifying major NTFP and pilot test standard harmonization across ASEAN. So hopefully, with this CBNE, we will be able to set up activities to piloting several standards for specific species, for example, and then strengthen coordination of joint strategies in seeking better market access for ASEAN forest product. For example, how the NTFP development could ensure branding and good labeling, eco-labeling, and enhancing competitiveness through several activities such as formulate supportive policies for trade facilitation, including, for example, addressing non-tariff measures, promoting fair trade, enhance capacity of SME, including a technical assistance for community forest enterprise, in particular, to get better known about the international standard. And then I also would like to highlight one of important milestone under the ASEAN cooperation in forestry. Next, please, which actually already discussed yesterday during the 2nd June event of the CBNE, which is the ASEAN Guideline for Sustainable Harvest and Resource Management Protocol for selected NTFP. I think despite the dialogue on subsistence and commercializations, the ASEAN member state has put the concern on the necessity to address sustainable harvest of resource management protocol for selected non-timber forest product. This document has become a reference for policy formulation on sustainable management of NTFP, as this document has already adopted by the ministers last year in October. And this also will help ASEAN member state to be able to promote awareness on the value of sustainable forest resource management and importance of sustainable harvest, enhance partnership and cooperation among stakeholders. I noticed that there are at least 3 main features of this guideline that will be helpful for the ASEAN member state. Among other, socio-ecological framework for sustainable management of NTFP. This includes sustainable harvest limits, resilience, adaptive capacity. So I would like to highlight the adaptive capacity. I think this is very natural for the NTFP product, and guiding principle for socio-ecological monitoring of NTFP management protocol addressing ecological knowledge, community engagement, info sharing, participatory data collection, establishing partnership, adaptive monitoring, and some example of socio-ecological protocols for specific NTFP like honey, resin, fruits, rattan, and bamboo. I think this guideline is very useful for ASEAN member states to move forward how to align their national standard that can be recognized among ASEAN member states. Next, please. My last slide. I would like to highlight several priorities beyond 2021. The first, of course, following the milestone of the guideline, the ASEAN member state is willing to further implement and elaborate how this guideline could be developed to support policy development related to the NTFP. The second is promote cooperation on sustainable production of NTFP and services, including ecotourism management, medicinal, herbal, and aromatic plants. And then capacity building, exchange best practices for NTFP development, enhance competitiveness through joint promotion of NTFP, and establishing networking to facilitate trade. So I think ASEAN member state, for example, cooperative networking might be working to promote this joint promotion, develop regional strategy to enhance market access. I think this is quite important and become one of the focus area of the cooperation of the ASEAN cooperation in forestry toward 2025. Hopefully, there will be strategy that can be useful for ASEAN member states to develop their NTFP, and then promote private sector's engagement in supporting community forestry enterprise. I think part of it would be promoting the private sector engagement as well as for the CSR, corporate social responsibility. I think those windows is very important. And last but not least, as also underlined by the previous speaker, we are facing challenge in database information on NTFP production, for example. Without those basic data, I think it is difficult for decision makers to make decision how they could develop and ensure the harvest of the NTFP, utilization of NTFP will be sustained. So I think establishing database of NTFP and monitoring tools to support sustainable management of NTFP is quite crucial for ASEAN member states, and also to provide a clear recommendation how to move forward with the NTFP policy development related to promoting competitiveness, trade facilitation, and also to open better market access. Since the consumers, they need kind of sustain, for example, sustain supply, and also from the business side, they would like to have to ensure that the products is can be provided within sustainable timeline, and also with the availability of the resources in the forest. I think those conclude my presentation, and thank you very much for your attention. Back to you, Dr. Doris. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Dian, and congratulations to you, who I know have been pushing very hard for the implementation and adoption, endorsement of the guidelines on NTFPs. So hopefully we'll get to talk a little bit more about that. Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Attorney Edna Magigad from NTFP-EP Asia, who will present on NTFP policies in ASEAN, status, gaps, and opportunities for CBNEs. Attorney Magigad has been a legal and policy specialist for 18 years. She started as a developmental lawyer with Saligan, a legal NGO in the Philippines, capacitating farmers, workers, urban poor women, and local communities to understand the law and to use it or change it to improve lives. Since then, Attorney Magigad has worked as natural resource governance, climate change, agrobiodiversity and farmers' rights to seeds, social forestry, REDD+, landscape restoration, tenure, safeguards, and various national and with various national and international organizations and agencies, including NTFP Asia as a governance advisor, and the Philippines Department of Environment and Natural Resources as a consultant on several programs, including policy development for biodiversity-friendly enterprises, which, by the way, this last has become the newest department administrative order within the DNR. She also worked with UNDP as policy specialist for program development on access and benefit sharing, and is also on sustainable land management. Attorney Magiga, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Doris, for the generous introduction. I hope my signal will hold because I just got dropped 2 times while in this webinar. Please. Okay. So from the discussion earlier, so I would share with you that there are lots of sticks, but very few carrots in the policies in NTFP. But glad to know that this is also the priorities of the ASEAN in terms of the sustainable management, market linkages, and of course, giving more carrots than stick. So next slide, please. So as a background, what I will be presenting is actually in these 5 publications, which is actually an assessment that forms part of the NTEP's contribution or role in policy support and knowledge sharing with the recently concluded Asean Swiss Partnership for Social Forestry and Climate Change, or ASFCC. So with me here is Joanna Del Rosario, who wrote the Malaysia and Indonesia review, what I did the Philippines, Cambodia, and the ASEAN one. So just to give a snapshot of what are the key findings as well as the status gaps and opportunities for NTFP moving forward in the region. The criteria used for the assessment are 6, and it is actually with a bias for community-based for CBNE. So first is community access to NTFP from harvest, utilization, production, and sustainable management. Then we go to NTFP transport and trade. And then if there is recognition across the 4 countries in terms of the protection, promotion of the rights of indigenous people and local communities regarding NTFP use and management. And the next, are there actually laws supporting value addition or processing of this community enterprise so that this NTFP would have more markets, premium pricing, as well as would reach a lot of consumers. And then the last 2 would be on NTFP financing. Where can they get the money? And then the support. And of course, the last, what are the existing investment and partnership for NTFP development and MSMEs? Next, please. So this is partly as a response to racial. What are we regulating and why? So let's start with what are NTFPs? So if you look at the definition here, there's actually kind of like a mix of definition across the 4 countries. In Cambodia, it says all forest resources that are not timber, but includes also ecosystem services, forest services, etc. So you have 15 classification of NTFP that is in a PRACAS or forestry regulation. In Indonesia, it is defined as both vegetable and animal forest products along with their derivative and cultivated products except wood originating from the forest ecosystem. And they have 2 classifications, plant-based NTFPs, animal-based NTFPs, and they have listed 575 species. Similar with Cambodia, they actually have a listing of 900 species as NTFP. These are official listing. But as we go on now to the next slide, we see that this is not actually happening. Next slide, please. In the 2 other countries. In Malaysia, there is no national regulation or I think awareness on NTFP, but these two regions, these 2 states, I mean Sarawak and Sabah, They have a definition of what is a forest produce. And if you can see here, that NTFPs are part of that definition. There is no classification provided. In the Philippines, very exciting. Um, it is subsumed under the forest product and classified as ordinary minor forest product under our old forestry code. It's not only ordinary, but it's also minor. But there is actually a draft policy, a framework on NTFP, and this was really facilitated a lot during the time of Mr. Orlando Panganiban, during the time that he was in the community forestry division. But of course, let me also recognize the Philippine team of the policy on Miss Ruth Canlas and Kate, who has worked on this for like 15 years. And it's also very, sorry, it shows how good policies can really be oppressive. And I will tell you about this later on when I discuss NTFP trade. So there is no classification on NTFP in the present policy in the Philippines, but there's a draft, Dawa said earlier, and there are 4 classification: fiber, industrial, and then food, beverages. What is actually taken out was on the animal and animal products. And the work of Dr. Razal has been really instrumental in the development of NTFP policy in the Philippines. Next, please. So we go now on to the key findings of the study. So as you can see, the definition of what is NTFP and classification vary per country, but what we can do is have a common ground across ASEAN that there can be unity in the treatment of NTFP as an important subsector in forestry, given what is happening now, the interest, the consumer demand, climate change, as well as looking for low emissions livelihood, etc. So very few national policies specifically mention NTFPs. There's no specific agenda to promote development, management, sustainable utilization, but there are a lot of policies that would say extraction, export fees, permit fees. So the first thing that is kind of robust in the countries except Malaysia is the permit and the fee system for NTFP. The lack of specific policies such as program support, financing, business enterprise development, etc., hinders enabling support for NTFP. So as you can see, NTFP management in general really lacks clarity in the countries, and there is absence as to, for example, in Malaysia, as to also lack of policies for research and development. But there are also, I would go on later to discuss this specifically, is that there are specific NTFPs, like of course rattan, bamboo, that are priority for each country, and that would have their own research and development. But to sum it all, the other NTFPs are lacking in terms of support of R&D embedded in policy. So when you have this lack of data on NTFPs and government actually collects limited or no data at all, like in Malaysia, you now have a question: what are we regulating? What are we promoting? And if this is not in the forestry policy, what those in the R&D sector, in the business and innovation sector would not really have any idea what is the priority of the forestry sector. So it's important that even like a glimpse of NTFP and what are NTFP should be in the main forestry regulation. Next. So access and tenure rights to land and natural resources have improved with social forestry scheme, agrarian laws, particularly for Indonesia. But in terms of having more products reach the market, the access permit and transport permit are very difficult for communities. The permitting, the cost, and the time is also really onerous, as they would say. And in policies, usually communities are are allowed to access and harvest NTFP, but is meant to be subsistence. When they now do commercialization, now what triggers commercialization? If I get 1 ton versus I get a few kilos, so what are the changes? These are not really that defined. And last would be on the law and intellectual property rights, as well as, so the law and intellectual property rights, as you would have noticed, this is there's a collective mark here. But in several countries, more people, more community groups are actually using IPR as to safeguard their business enterprises. In Cambodia, their pepper is already, you have the indicators, geographic indicators here, also the tinala. The other one here, and this was mentioned, is bioprospecting. So this is also very exciting. In the Philippines, a new drug, I used that one, anti-inflammatory drug for Bratan product is under clinical trial, and I had access to that when I was doing some work with ABS, and it's really something exciting. Similar with Banaba, etc. So there are already NTFPs, derivatives that are going into the Nagoya Protocol on access and benefit sharing, I think in the next few years. Next, please. So let me go through a highlight of the 6 criteria. As I mentioned earlier, the laws and policies covering social forestry, and then more recognition of indigenous people's rights in protected area, in concessions awarded by Indonesia. These are all really providing access for communities to develop NTFPs. But now when they have tenure, the next one would be how they can actually have that ready for the market. So in Cambodia, you have also a lot of developments, particularly in formalizing access, land titling, community land titling. Next slide. You would also have that in next slide, please. In Malaysia, no, in the Philippines, as well as in Indonesia. In Malaysia, of course, Sarawak and Sabah, you have here the Forestry Department, our commercial utilization NTFPs within communal forest is legally prohibited, but there is a system of permitting as well. Next. Next. Okay. So NTFP transport and trade, there are regulations on transport and commercialization and the existence of registration for small enterprises, and of course forest charges, etc. I think the most advanced in terms of NTFP at the country level, NTFP support from development to market is Indonesia. You have the national strategy for the development of NTFPs, which actually provides this support from planning to post-harvest. But I would like to take a moment to show you this Almasiga trade and how when permitting is actually made, what do you call this, more accessible, then it would really create much equity and improve poverty. So it's poverty elevation. So the story of the Almasiga trade here is that they eradicated the middleman. So from 11 pesos, the toppers would get now 30 pesos because PAB, that's a cooperative organization of indigenous people, have now controlled their business, and now they have at least 1 million pesos every year as annual sales, and the communities are now allowed to do community inventory, so it cut the cost from $1,000 to just $400 for the inventory alone, and from 700 days they can get a permit for 155 days now. So a lot of development there in terms of practical application, but what is telling in this PUB case is that the policy did not change. It's just the behavior of DNR field offices who attended one of these talk shop, and actually there were cases filed by communities about their issues with permitting, and as well as, of course, policy dialogue with them to understand the importance of Almasiga permitting for these indigenous people. Next, please. The recognition and protection of indigenous knowledge systems. It's very important because these are traditional occupation, and hopefully the standards as well as sustainable management of NTFP can be just in the community managed plans, and that is connected to how they actually promote and support IKSP within their lands. So as you can see, there are a lot of policies supporting them. But the issue is when you operationalize this policy and make practical use of it, there is less operational guidelines. So I have a lot of consultation with local communities asking me clarificatory question of what this means. And it's good in policy, but in practice, it needs a lot of support in terms of understanding it. Next. So value addition. So there are already some support, but a lot of needed to incentivize this. Next, please. Financing. There is financing support in Indonesia specifically, and in Cambodia, a lot of microfinance now. And in the Philippines also, similar to Cambodia, you have support for community-based forest management. Yes, and next. I think the last few slides, please. Let me go to the recommendations. Slide, please. So in terms of recommendation, there's a need to continue the support and encourage social forces scheme. It's really a door opener for a lot of enterprise support as well as development. And then simplified policies in terms of monitoring protocols, etc. And then strengthen the network of agencies and organizations involved in NTFPs, particularly the policymakers, so they would know actually the value of NTFP, what data is needed, who collects them, and how to use this data. And now there could be like an ecosystem account for NTFP. If we look at the entire landscape, you would say the value of carbon. Hopefully in the next few years, you would say this is the value of NTFP. So with that, I hope I share a snapshot of the 5 case studies that you can download actually in our website. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Attorney Magigad. There's so much richness to your presentation, and I would encourage, I would encourage our participants to actually download the material, go through the information, because there really are very practical recommendations there, but also some general lessons that I think would have more generic application across and even beyond the region. Okay. So our last speaker is Mr. Orlando Panganiban, the Director of Cooperation and Project Division of the Asian Forest Cooperation Organization, or AFOCO. As former Chief of the Forest Resources Management Division of the Forest Management Bureau of the Philippines Department of Environment and Natural Resources, he also managed the DENR JICA Forest Land Management Project, national focal point, and also the focal point and leader for the Asean Working Group on Social Forestry representing the Philippines. Let us welcome Mr. Panganiban. The floor is yours.
Yeah, good afternoon. I hope I can be heard. I would like to say that for the organizer, we would like to thank you on behalf of the Secretariat for choosing AFOCO for this forum. I know that AFOCO is just one of the contributors of CBNE development, but we are here and we are very thankful. So for 10 minutes, I will be direct to the point, and for my presentation, I will cover a short introduction of our organization, our projects, and capacity building activities. I will also share a few slides on Landscape Partnership Asia, on the restoration of drylands and drought-prone areas. And I would like to conclude with some opportunities that AFOCO can bring in terms of CBNE collaboration. I would like to say that our contribution is not directly CBNE in nature, but generally to local livelihood improvement and community enterprise development. Yeah, next slide, please. So we are an intergovernmental organization that focuses on forestry. I think we are the one or the only one that is intergovernmental and focusing on forestry and all types of forests. And our existence can be traced through our meaningful collaboration with the ASEAN and ASEAN member states. In fact, in 2011, ASEAN bilaterally signed a forest cooperation agreement with the Republic of Korea as our prime mover until now. We call it a small O agreement. So we're very thankful of that, considering that the cooperation agreement served also as a venue for the dialogue for AFOCO establishment. And our existence was as a formal organization was in April 27, 2018. And our founding members, we are lucky to have two from the ASEAN member state, Myanmar and Vietnam, including Bhutan and Timor-Leste, and of course, Republic of Korea. Next slide, please. Our vision is to have a greener Asia with resilient forests, landscape, and community. And our mission is strengthening cooperation in the forest sector and promoting action-oriented practices of SFM through policy support, capacity building, and inclusive partnership to address the impacts of climate change. And next slide, please. And in terms of membership, we are basically covering all ASEAN member states, with the two ASEAN member states, as observers, and we have additional members from Bhutan in South Asia, Kazakhstan in Central Asia, Mongolia in East Asia, and Timor-Leste. So we are based in Seoul, South Korea, and we have a regional education and training center in Myanmar. Next slide, please. In terms of our strategic plan, which is, I would say that is under review by the guidance of our assembly, but currently we have 4, and I'm happy to emphasize that we have a particular focus on local livelihood improvement and community-based and small enterprise development. Next slide, please. And our approach is action-oriented implementation, regional-based partnership. I would say not only towards participating with our country members, but also partners in forest cooperation, and also with focus on country-driven project development based on the priorities of our member states. In terms of our projects, as you can see, 57% under priority 5, or strengthening institutional capabilities, having the biggest share, considering that it includes the establishment of our RETC training center in Myanmar. And next is under priority 1 in terms of initiating customized restoration and reforestation models, followed by priority 2 on R&D in climate change adaptation approaches, and of course, local livelihood improvement and community-based enterprise development. Next slide, please. But as you can see, these are exactly the projects that we are highlighting in our website. And I would say that except for research projects, all our projects are with community livelihood component. In fact, 8 of them, while 2 have a community livelihood project. It's a livelihood project in its objectives. And we have 2 which focuses on community enterprise project. We have one in Bhutan, which is sustainable community-based enterprise for improved livelihood. And it talks about, they call it non-wood forest commodities that also considers, payment for environmental services component and ecotourism in their component activities. And for the Philippines, it's about timber. It's not non-timber forest product, but it's about vertical integration in wood processing through people's organization in community-based forest management areas in the Philippines. So it's more than growing trees. It's about harvesting, processing, value adding, and even up to marketing of timber. And I think potentially NTFP can also have a vertical integration project in the future. Yeah, next slide. And our projects in the pipeline, we have about 10, and I would like to say that we have finally come up with a regional project that talks about, in particular, on NTFP, and it's a regional project involving all our member countries. And it's entitled Improve Local Community Livelihoods to Increase Benefits from Non-Timber Forest Products, Modeling Scalable Community-Based Enterprises in Asia. So we are happy to inform you about that. And we have also a project with the Asean ROK Cooperation Fund, or AKCF, on capacity building and enhancing resilience to forest fire and local livelihood. And I'm happy also to report to you that in both regional projects, NTFP is our partner. And as you can see, it's a major project for APOCO. We would like to be more inclusive in terms of cooperation, and our direction is to develop more regional projects than in-country projects, but addressing in-country priorities as well. Okay, so I'm talking about the NTFP regional project that we have. It's basically a premise on the observation that there are communities that are working on NTFP livelihood or enterprise that tends to be a self-governing marketing organization, and they are of various levels. And also with the recognition that the capture of benefits are also variable. And seeing the potential of NTFP, we would like to improve and promote inclusive NTFP management in terms of sustainable forest management. So we have these outputs and objectives that I would like to share. Maybe if you are interested in the Q&A portion, then I would like to deal more on this. And our initial take of this is to draw lessons from successful community-based enterprises and to focus on gaps to reach wider impacts on CBFME development. Next, please. So this is how our regional training looks, and I would like to emphasize that this is a venue, and at the same time, a means for us to do community development training courses. And since 2014, we have covered a respectable milestone in terms of conducting 78 training courses, and 50% of that, or 38 courses, are related to community development. And it involves 7,416 participants. 52% are coming from local communities, and 36% are coming from the government technicians and policymakers. You may wonder why we cover more local communities, because we are also conducting community development training courses in Myanmar, where our training center is located. And yeah, next. I would like to share to you the latest recent partnership of APOCO with C4ICRAP, and where we signed a partnership agreement last October 2020. It's about Landscape Partnership Asia on the restoration of drylands and drought-prone areas, with an ambition to contribute to national and international targets on the restoration of forests. That includes, agricultural drylands and drought-prone areas in the geographical areas where we operate, with an initial 10 million hectares to be brought under integrated dryland and drought-prone management. And we have the 10 members of APOCO member countries. Plus, we have Kyrgyzstan also as part of Central Asia. In terms of partnership, we have four, kinds of partners. We have government, and we have implementing partners. We have funding partners, and I'm happy also to inform you that in terms of technical partners, we have already a strong indication of, having NTFP-EP Asia to be with us in LTA. And IIRR has already formally submitted their intention joining the LPA. And I think for NTFP-EP, it's just a matter of time, and soon we will have their confirmation as well. We have also Stockholm Environment Institute, which is a potential technical partners in LPA. In terms of implementing partners, I would just like to highlight that in the implementation of projects and partnership activities, I think community-based associations, which cuts across both forest and agricultural lands, will be heavily involved, and their roles as listed in the slide. Okay, I think I should also mention that in LPA, more training and capacity building will be the involvement of our community organizations, including implementation of scalable restoration projects. And that is in terms of activity 2 and 3 in terms of LPA. So we are quite excited to have this, to have the implementation of LPA activities, as we have already concluded our visioning and road mapping, and we are ready to approach technical partners and especially donors, and we will have more activities for LPA. Yeah, I think this will be my last slide, and I would like to focus more on this slide. And in terms of challenges, I would like to say that I will not repeat those challenges. But in the context of APOCO, I think in terms of capacities, policies, governance, and institutional concerns, these are cross-cutting concerns. And I think what's highlighted here are the most important part that we are considering in terms of these concerns. Like, for example, we're talking about good policies, but I think bottom line is, governance, concerns in terms of implementing good policies for NTFPs and CBNE. And I'd like to reiterate that we have a cross-cutting concern on the standards, R&D and product development, market sharing and benefit sharing in terms of technologies. And also I'd like to include infrastructure, and this goes beyond the forestry sector. That is why it should be also highlighted how well we can involve others sector as well for CBNE. And the second point that I'd like to emphasize is the technological divide and adaptation to the new normal. You know, right now we are having this, you know, I've been in Apoko practically during the pandemic, and it's a different thing now, and I'm more concerned, we are more concerned on how we share knowledge and how communities will access information. It's more on the concern of the communities rather than, you know, government and technical supporters like us. But in terms of our community, I think we should find new ways of doing things. And I think we are on our way to improve it, including capacity building, market engagement, production, and trade. These are all, you know, linked with each other in terms of this concern. And now, let me talk about some opportunities that Apoko can provide. And I would like to start with you know, I think by degree of importance, I'd like to say that Apoko focuses more on capacity building because this is where our strength will be in terms of having our RETC, not only as a venue for training, but also in terms of our regular training. And I'd like to inform you that because not even before the pandemic, we have an in-country community development trainings that we are implementing, which means that these are customized community development training, and CBNE can be part of it. So this is where we will collaborate more, I should say. And for the Landscape Partnership Asia, I think what I can say is we can have more collaboration now that we have NTFP as one of our technical partners in terms of scaling up restoration, in terms of CBNE as a means to achieve forest restoration in drylands and drought-prone areas. Number three, I think we also anticipate meaningful results to our regional project on NTFP. You know, this is a 6-year of, you know, of a collaboration with CBF and CBNE practitioners, policymakers, and technical service providers. And in the process, I would like to say that maybe most, if not all, of the challenges that I listed here can be partly addressed to our regional projects. So we want to have more collaboration with all the participants and potential partners for this project in terms of knowledge sharing and capacity building. And also we'd like to reach participation of the public sector for this regional project. Number four, in terms of policy development, I'd like to highlight that AFOCO has a regular activity on high-level annual thematic dialogue. This is a high-level discourse for policy improvement, and in the process, we can have Asean through the ASOP and similar bodies in South and you know, East Asia and Central Asia with us. And potentially, and I'm quite excited to have, you know, those policies like what Diane said in terms of NTFP guidelines in the ASEAN also be shared, and to reach higher, you know, political commitment in this dialogue, because we will be involving here, you know, as high as a level of vice minister or minister, you know, working on forestry. And lastly, I think for a few, this is something new. This is Peace Forest Initiative. Peace Forest Initiative is a global initiative which serves as a partnership framework which focuses on the land degradation neutrality in fragile and conflict-affected regions. And the objective of PFI is to promote peace and build trust between neighboring countries through transboundary cooperation, through sustainable land management that I think it highlights forest, and it's also very relevant to NTFP-Y, because I think of the nature of NTFP having, some cultural significance in terms of resource management conflicts that we would like to bring in PFI. So as soon as natural resource conflict and land use conflicts between neighboring, countries, I think this transboundary concern can cover NTFP, and I think as a good opportunity for us to be engaged with. The plan of APOCO is to be part of the working group that will work on some promising concept notes, project concept note for Peace Forest Initiative. So as soon as we have the go signal from the UNCCD Secretariat on the inclusion of resource management conflicts and internal conflicts, not only transboundary concerns, I think NTFP is one of the promising topic. So in closing, let me thank you again, and I would like to say that more than initiating forest cooperation, we would like to see more complementation and partnership along the way. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Panganiban. That was really very encouraging, and it's good to know that AFOCO has picked up on many of these very important directions. Anyway, we were supposed to have some time for Q&A, but since we're now over time and can only stretch it for a few more minutes, what I will do is to acknowledge that, because this is really a very important policy-oriented discussion, to acknowledge that we do have representation from some member states here as well. And so with your permission, I would like to prioritize and provide perhaps 1 minute maximum each for in case we have comments or additional information from our representatives from Cambodia. Mr. Long Ratanakoma is here, I know, and Dr. E. Lang representing Myanmar as well. And depending on how much more time we can very quickly also pick up on this conversation. I'm sure that from the AFOCO presentation, there's a lot of questions about whether and to what extent the future would also allow for business expansion support for some of our CBNEs, and whether there are initiatives in many of these countries. But anyway, if you wish the floor, Mr. Long Ratanakoma, from Cambodia, is there anything you would wish to add? I'm not sure if Mr. Ratanakoma is still here, but Dr. E. Lang, are you still there? Okay, so I guess they might have dropped off the line already. Okay, please allow me, Mike. Oh, administrators, they're not allowed to unmute. Can you please unmute Mr. Ratanakoma?
Okay, yeah.
Sorry about that.
Okay, good afternoon, Dr. Florica Pistrino. And okay, good afternoon, all everybody. Thank you very much for all the comprehensive, thank you all the speakers related to the non-timber forest product. Oh. Yes, so let me only highlight a little bit the non-timber forest product in Cambodia. As we know, like in Cambodia, for the community development in Cambodia is very important, because this community forest play very important role for the local people benefit for the I support. I agree from the assessment that presented from the Dr. Anna, and yeah, related the non-timber product in Cambodia. So okay, in Cambodia, in fact, it's like a policy support for the like how to say something like how to move the non-timber product for the business, you know, yeah, or for the enterprise, something like this. But even though, you know, government of Cambodia tried, you know, in last 2 years, we support, you know, always like non-timber product, not just only the traditional use, not just only the customary use, but for the economic purpose. It means like that make the local people who depend on the forest can make the income generation from the activity. That is why, like this year, we try to, you know, discuss more with our development partner, you know, like AFOCO, like TC, ADC in Cambodia, like NTFP-EP as well. We try to discuss more how to, you know, support the county forestry to become from not just only customary use, but you know, to make from the like small scale enterprise or medium enterprise or big enterprise, something like this. You know, this is very important that for the Cambodian, you know, we support for this policy like Dr. Orlando present about the AFOCO programs. Here, Cambodia, we happy and, you know, cooperate with the AFOCO for the activity as well. Yeah, I think it's for me, it's what the still, you know, have challenges in Cambodia, even currently, you know, have the like COVID pandemic. So more the worker, they move from outside, from Thailand, from other countries to Cambodia. So sometimes they measure the like illegal, they try to assign to the forest for the illegal logging or other activities, something for their livelihood. This is all awakening. But even though, you know, also we still concerning about like related, how to say, like county tenure right. When we have the like approved from the Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry, and also we have agreement, but still, you know, has like sometimes the poor people, they try encroach the land, encroach the forest area. After that, the government try to solve that the issue by like convert the county forest that encroach already, move to the social land concession. It means to the people that here that, you know, that challenges to the county forestry as well. Even though the government try to solve this issue, you know, like by like to use the, how to say, like the law, forestry law, and also like to coordinate with the provincial government authority as well, how to solve this problem as well. Yeah, I think it's here because of time limited, so I think okay, I just only highlight this at some point. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Koma. We are we only have 4 more minutes. I don't think that would really you know, give us enough time to have another round of comments and questions. But I would encourage with the concurrence of the administrators and the organizers, if you can send in your questions by chat, and I'm sure the organizers would consider them, and you know, and would also encourage the speakers to come back with specific details. So if you would allow me, you know, just a few more minutes before we close this session, let me just pick up some points to tie together some of the main messages that came out of this session. One, I think, from the presentation from the global level, the regional level, and the study across countries, there are very encouraging trends, both globally and within the region. There seems to be greater recognition of and a general respect for the contributions of NTFPs to local economies and livelihoods, and also a better understanding, more so than in the past, of their connection to local culture, the maintenance of diversity and diverse landscapes within these countries. So I think now the conditions seem to be right for better NTFP management in a coordinated way. Key points that came out. One is that sustainable NTFP enterprise development really is very closely interlinked with sustainable forest management, and that they are inextricably linked, and those factors and the approaches that facilitate sustainable forest management are the same kinds of approaches that would also facilitate CBNE development, so that people-oriented, livelihood-friendly SFM approaches, notably social forestry, really can be critical components of effective strategies for CBNE policy support. Highlighted by many presentations of the important role of tenure security, land and resource rights, access and benefit sharing, that would have to be part of the mix. Second point, support for CBNEs need to be nuanced. In other words, they need to be rooted in and implemented with sensitivity to local culture and environmental local context. However, having said that, it also requires coordinated, strategic, comprehensive, and I would say consistent support, preferably within a context of regional or transboundary cooperation. But as Mr. Panganiban says, it's not enough to have a cooperation, but also ensure complementarity and complementation as well. So this support needs to be both nuanced, fine-tuned at the local level, but also supported and aligned to more higher level processes, preferably a political process within ASEAN, which we already have in a way, but also possibly beyond ASEAN for critical ecosystems. But this would have to be consistent within the forest sector as well as across other closely relevant sectors. For example, agriculture, mining, energy, road building, et cetera, et cetera. A third point is the need to balance incentives and disincentives for NTFP management. At the moment, the scale seems to be tipped heavily on the order of over-regulation and disincentives, so that this creates needless burden and high transactions costs, especially for local communities, with the result that governance failures, including bribery, corruption, illegality, are facilitated in a context like this. So the practical imperative is for simplification of bureaucratic requirements, swapping regulation and disincentives and control measures for encouragements, such as support for organizational building, capacity building, certification, and facilitation of market access, in order to encourage self-regulation, institutional development appropriate to the context and the resources to be managed. And the reason why this seems to be a more promising approach is because the practice of NTFP harvesting and value addition in many cases really are part and embedded of local cultures, which means that local traditions and local institutions and norms and roles would have evolved over time alongside this very critical livelihood activity. And therefore leaving space for local organization, local norm setting, and local implementation, as well as monitoring of themselves and their resources, would probably lead to better results at more cost-effective means for policymakers. Fourth observation is that there is capacity building necessary at all levels, not only at the local community level, organizational level, but also with NGOs and agencies and national institutions that are charged with NTFP regulation and management as well. And in this regard, it is encouraging for AFOCO to have it as a high priority, as well as the ASEAN the ASEAN guidelines on NTFPs having picked this up. And finally, the point is that the consultative process will be required to develop policies that in the end could be implemented and are practical at the ground level. As Edna said, there's not necessarily an absence of laws and frameworks, legal frameworks, but it's really the effective, practical implementation of those laws and policies. And this requires, one, the engagement of all stakeholders, but also collection of relevant data and information that is accessible to all. So monitoring, joint assessments of all stakeholders that would also provide transparency and commonality of information from which common actions and common policies could be developed. So adaptive collaborative management that involves all key stakeholders at various levels and support to facilitate that. And finally, I think we end with a high note and a very positive note that during this session, a number of opportunities have been identified for future collaboration, future work, and concrete actions that are already possible. And AFOCO has listed a number of that. So hopefully certification from the side of ASEAN, programs from the side of AFOCO, and hopefully this could facilitate concrete next steps from this session. So let me end there. I know we're out of time. To thank everybody, thank our speakers, thank our participants, and also encourage that this then continue to be part of a conversation for concrete next steps. Thank you so much.